Just want to get started with everyone's favorite and most familiar question. What was your first computer?
Right, so my first computer was a Commodore Amiga 500, but before I got that, I was about 9 or 10 years old when I got that. But before then, I used to tinker around with the Amstrad green screen computer that my mother had for word processing, and she also used to have those kind of hybrid typewriter computer kind of devices. Yeah,
we had a typewriter, but it was definitely not a computer. It was in an old box, and it was you'd plug it in, and it would become a typewriter, and that's all it ever became.
It was like the phones, the very first mobile phones, with just a tiny LCD strip, and you had to like key back and forwards to see the next word. I mean, it was probably not better than an analog typewriter.
It was a very big deal to be able to just make a typo and delete it and to fix it, and the digital ones gave you that ability. So that was pretty amazing. So what did you do when you got the Commodore Amiga?
So back then I was 9 years old. So back then I was really into playing games, doing a bit of the kind of homebrew programming, as you know. So the Amiga was the successor to the C64, which was a really a big one for hobbyists and home computing. So you'd get the magazines, and there'd be the recipe, and you'd copy it through, and then you'd have like the really, really basic racing game with the lines and your little sprite moving around.
Sure.
And then
What's nice about typing the code is you could edit the game, right? If you want to make the thing faster, if you want to give yourself more lives. Sometimes we would go in and edit the save files of games and give ourselves millions of dollars in SimCity or whatever it was. And it used to just be a variable you could find as a kid. And now I'm sure it's all encoded and encrypted, and it's inside the game. You can't just edit it. But you could back then.
And then I found this program called Octamed, which was what you call a tracker, which was a music creation software environment. And so what you see these days, a lot of people write software in things like Ableton Live or Native Instruments, and you see kind of the timeline moving across the screen. Trackers would move kind of vertically, kind of matrix style. You would see the passage of time top to bottom, and you'd have kind of like an Excel spreadsheet with lots of little points. They'd be your channels, the columns, and then you would populate the grid with different hexadecimal values, and those would be referencing a synthesizer or a very short sample, because you've got, tiny amounts of memory and working memory. And then we'd be making kind of chip-tuney, demo-scene music.
Was it kind of like a music box or a player piano? You set down like coordinates, and then it cranks through and
it's kind of like a digital version of a player piano, but with much more flexibility. So I mean, back in those, the Octamed was quite primitive, but then that great thing about software and hardware back then was that the constraints forced people to be really creative. It was the same with the games as well. I mean, the amount they could pack onto one 1.44 megabyte floppy disk was unreal.